Ethics differs significantly from Kantian ethics because utilitarianism says that the moral worth of actions is defined by what? Moral worth of actions defined by the consequences. And if you don't like that word consequences, what might be a good synonym? Outcomes. Yes. Now recall that for Immanuel Kant's ethics, Kant argued that the only thing that is good in and of itself, this is review. Kant said the only thing that is good in and of itself was what he called a good will. Now I want to make sure this is nice and sparkling clear, and it should already be, but Kant was not talking about empathy. When Kant speaks of the good will, he is not talking about empathy. Why do you think Kant would have said that empathy ought not to define moral worth? Any takers?
According to them, you're saying that that person isn't worth as much if you give them empathy?
Depending on what else you add to it, you might be on the right track. If the only reason I'm concerned about your well-being is because of emotions, I might actually be acting how? Selfishly. In other words, my helping you out might really be just to make me feel good. And if I am merely helping you out to make me feel good, I don't deserve a moral gold star. For Kant, the only thing that is truly morally good in terms of a motivation is what I would call the rational desire to obey the what? The only thing that is truly moral is the rational desire to obey the moral law. You're not obeying the moral law because you want to. You're doing it because you ought to. Yes?
So would Kant not agree with that statement of moral actions defined by consequences? Would he agree with like moral worth of actions defined by motives?
Yes. And these are the two words that mean the same thing. For Kant, it's a matter of your intention, or we would call your motives.
Okay.
The only moral motive for him is to act out of respect or duty to the moral law. If you desire to do something too much, you may not be acting in accordance with the moral motive, according to Kant. If you might be getting some kind of emotional rewards for it, your motives may not actually be moral ones. Now, it turns out that in many cases, utilitarianism and Kantian ethics would counsel you to do the same thing. It's just that they would likely to counsel you to do the same thing for what? Different underlying reasons. And if you remember my discussion of Mill's notion of higher pleasures. Mill's notion of higher pleasure would include something like empathy. Now, empathy might enable one to behave altruistically, but Kant wouldn't call it truly pure altruism. And why is this? Why would Kant say what Mill would call altruism, Kant would not call pure altruism? So remember, part of what motivates us, according to Mill, is that we actually do generate fellow feeling or concern for other people. That's what he would say morally mature people understand. They understand how to have compassion for other human beings. passion might lead you to do the moral thing, but Kant would say it leads you to do the moral thing for non-moral reasons. And I hope I'm fairly clear about that. Now, the end game for utilitarians is they wanted to see what kind of society. Bentham and Mill are sometimes classed among two very great British social reformers. Their aim was to take a society that was greatly flawed and apply utilitarian principles to it in order to get it closer to becoming a good society. Some of the things that they thought ought to be reformed, and Bentham was an early champion of this. What do you think Bentham thought the aim of the prison system ought to be? Yes?
To reform people rather than punish them?
Yes. Yeah. In other words, true reformation. And by the way, the reason why a lot of people want to, and I want to make this distinction here, Kant was a proponent of something that we call Lex Talionis. That's Latin for the law of the claw. More commonly translated as what? An eye for an eye, capital punishment. Now, the reason why Kant was for things like capital punishment is because he believed that the penal system was about giving people what they, quote unquote, deserve. Now, this is an important distinction. Many people who I know who are pro-capital punishment are for it for very different grounds than Kant was for it. Does anyone know what I'm talking about? I have some extended family. Yeah, Mr. Peters.
Therefore, because they see it as vengeance, and that's an unpure motive.
He's got it. Yeah, many of your average Joe six-packs who are for capital punishment, I have some extended family members who actually get very excited about the prospect of it. So much so that they would like to be the executioner because they would like to mete out justice. I say, no, you don't care about justice. You like the idea of harming people who you believe are bad people. It gives you pleasure. That is not what Kant had in mind. Justice is supposed to be what? Yeah, absolutely pure, absolutely unbiased. It's supposed to be unemotional. So if you are for capital punishment because you actually seethe at the mouth or foam at the mouth wanting for revenge, that is very un-Kantian. And he would actually say your desire is actually an immoral one. Because your only desire should be to give people what they deserve. And if you take joy in harming other people, you might be as bad internally as the murderer is. If you take joy in it, you might be as bad internally as the murderer is. And I think that's a fabulous cautionary tale. I think by hearing this, it ought to tell people perhaps to look where? To look inside and to think, well, what really does motivate me to think the way I do about certain things? Perhaps I am an ugly person internally when I look in the mirror. Justice and vengeance are very different things. And Kant is clear about this. Now, the utilitarian would only be for something like capital punishment if what? If it really led to something like the greater good. Because remember, for the utilitarians, right and wrong are not a matter of justice. They are a matter of what will produce the most optimific outcomes. And they believe that the most socially optimistic outcomes, or optimal if you prefer, would be to actually consider things like prison systems as reformatories. Because remember, the aim of the system ought to be to improve conditions for human beings. And by the way, someone like Mill would likely say that the desire for capital punishment does what to all of us? Brings out the most hateful aspects of us. In other words, people who are seething for capital punishment, and then you give it to them, say, yeah, we'll execute these people. We are actually bringing out the baser desires within them. We are not making better people. We are actually creating less decent, less sympathetic human beings, and people whose thirst for blood. Excuse me. Admittedly, and we talked about Malthus earlier in this chapter, poverty was very much on the minds of Bentham and Mill. Because they understood that the Industrial Revolution had not brought prosperity to the average Joe six-pack. It had actually brought longer working hours, driven down wages, and for the working classes, average life expectancy went down. And by the way, when people are hopeless, does not breed good conditions for a good society. Anyone know what I'm talking about? For those of you who like movies, I can recommend the film Trainspotting. I've mentioned this one before. The main characters are basically in a rundown part of northern England, or Scotland, excuse me, I guess, city environment. They are not well off, their lives lack meaning, and they don't have much of that four-letter word that I think people tend to need. It starts with an H. They don't have any hope. They don't have any hope. It does not surprise me that the main characters in the film turn to heroin. It doesn't surprise me. Because when your life is crap and meaningless, you probably feel a little bit better numb. You probably feel better numb. If you want to understand why people turn to certain things to ease the horror of their life, take a look at the society you have. If your society has problems, serious problems, it might tell you that there's something wrong with your what? That there's something wrong with the society. If you want to make society a decent thing, one of the things that you need to do is to see to it that people have genuine hope rather than fake hope. Impoverished people tend to turn to crime and drugs. Impoverished people tend to be unhappy. Impoverished people tend not to be good to their children. So if you want to know how to deal with a whole host of social ills, people like John Stuart Mill would suggest you need things like labor reform. I'm not just talking about the reform of child labor. I'm talking about things like what? Doing what to wages and conditions? Yeah. Improving wages and conditions. Now, of course, this means regulation. Well, keep in mind, Bentham and Mill would say the role of government is not just to keep us from killing one another. The role of government, because we are a collective, we are a society, the role of government ought to be to help to put forth policies that will actually create a what? Yeah, a better society. In other words, one that does in fact promote the greater good. Now, will a society that promotes the greater good make everyone happy? The The answer is no, because different people will have different viewpoints about what will make them happy. Some people will not be good utilitarians. Some people will only be looking out for number one. And they will actually try to steer society in ways that will benefit them. It is the aim of a good society to put those kind of people in what? To keep them in check. Because those kind of people's way of doing things will not be conducive to the long-term good of society. Now, is it easy to figure out what's in the long-term good? Admittedly, no, it's not. But Bentham and Mill would say that people who study these kinds of things carefully and actually have a genuine concern for the greater good of society will be better equipped for doing so. In other words, look at the policies that work and the policies that don't work. And you ought to choose those policies that will work, even if they sometimes might do what? And this is where we were leaving off last time. Mr. Shepard had questions. John Stuart Mill was a huge proponent of liberty. And admittedly, his being a proponent of liberty might have been sometimes at odds with his utilitarianism. Because utilitarianism, at least on the surface, might say that it is sometimes in the best interest of society to curtail certain liberties in the name of the greater good. Well, Mill says, at least in the case of freedom of speech, that even though freedom of speech might seem to be something that ought to be curtailed in the short term, because some people's free speech acts do what? I'll use the word. You've heard people say that certain kinds of speech acts ought to be prohibited because they are offensive. Guess what John Stuart Mill would have said about that? Because merely to be offended is not actual harm. The only kind of speech acts that do actual harm, according to him, would be things like yelling fire in a crowded theater. Because it would be likely to cause a what? Yeah, a panic, a stampede, people will get hurt. You know, that mistakes were made, you know, the whole bit. We shouldn't simply curtail people's freedom of speech simply because somebody might be offended. Because the fact is, your ability to be offended actually turns out to be a great opportunity for what? To hear other points of view that you may not have considered before. And by the way, merely being offended is not actual harm anyway. And by the way, some people who get offended by other people's ideas perhaps need to do what? This is me more than Mill. Perhaps they need to grow up a little bit. Because the fact is, hearing points of view with which you disagree with, and hearing other people's arguments for that point of view, is part of what keeps each and every one of us intellectually honest. Do you get my drift? As a matter of fact, if you hear somebody out who you disagree with, and really listen without prejudice, your mind might be what? You never know. Your mind might be changed. In other words, this is why he would contend democracy is sometimes messy. People will get offended when there's this cacophony of different points of view being told and heard. But in the end, out of that cacophony comes opportunities for greater intellectual growth. And in the end, he believed a what? He believed a better society. This is not in the book, but it relates to the book. In the England of John Stuart Mill, there was plenty of this. Can anyone guess what the main justification for censorship tended to be? They called all kinds of things pornographic, by the way. Things that we would know we would not call pornographic today. As a matter of fact, pieces of literature that are considered classics of feminism today were branded as public nuisances because they seem to encourage women not staying where?
In the house.
Oh, and in their rightful place. In other words, subservient to men. Most of you have probably heard of Kate Chopin, maybe read the story of an hour in a lit class or something. Stories like that were on the censored list because they put forth ideas that were perhaps dangerous to maintenance of the status quo. Because those in power wanted to maintain the status quo. Yeah, he didn't believe art should be censored. Art oftentimes does do what to people? Yeah, art does sometimes affect. But that's one of the benefits of a free society. You have the right to offend and to be offended. Even though you might not sometimes enjoy it. And he believed that this would be in the long-term good of society. Now, before I leave this completely, the ideas of Bentham and Mill also tended to promote this idea. These guys were what we call 19th century liberals. They were, in general, civil libertarians when it came to freedom of expression and freedom of speech. 19th century liberals were not anti-capitalism. As a matter of fact, they were pro-capitalism. But they believed what about capitalism? Here's my phrase for it. I like to say they advocated capitalism on a leash. Because they understood what about unrestrained capitalism? It would lead to the massive exploitation of a powerless underclass. Not only is this not good for those individuals economically, because what happened to their hours of work? Hours of work went up. There were some parts of the 19th century where people were working in excess of 80 hours a week in factories. In excess of 80 hours a week. Which sounds like it's almost what?
Impossible.
Yeah, almost mathematically impossible, but it was reality. And if you want to hear some stories about Northern English coal miners, I suggest that you read George Orwell's Road to Wigan Pier. He actually lived among miners. He also lived among tramps and so forth when he was writing this book. But these were men who had to walk because they had no other transportation to the mines. And that, of course, didn't count as part of their working day, but it did, of course, what? Those were hours tacked onto the day. And they had to trudge home at the end of the day. They sometimes spent more than 10 hours in the pits. And how much money did they make? Subsistence. It's no wonder a lot of Northern English coal miners, like D.H. Lawrence's dad. How many of you know D.H. Lawrence, the writer? One of his autobiographical books tells about his abusive father. It's no wonder he turned to the bottle on his way home. Because after all, when your life is that awful and destitute, it's also destitute of meaning. So the psyche feels a little bit better numb. I'm not advocating. I'm merely what? Explaining. Yeah, there's a difference between advocating and explaining. In other words, they were for things like reform of wages and conditions. They were for reform of things like exploitative child labor and things of this nature. They understood that there would be the need for regulations of one sort or another. Yeah?
Isn't capitalism on a leash just socialism?
I would call it something like the future of social democracy. Certainly not socialism, because the fact is, it merely regulates it. It merely regulates it, because who's still in the driver's seat in this position? I'm glad you asked. It still leaves what Marx will call this. It still leaves the bourgeoisie in the driver's seat. It merely puts them on a bit of a shorter chain than anything else. Because the bourgeoisie still reaps the what? Yeah, still reaps the benefits of the rewards. And in a way, Bentham and Mill would say what they're doing actually benefits the capitalist class in the long run. Because they saw that if capitalism did not reform itself, it would collapse, as Marx put it, under its own contradictions. And that's a real beautiful segue, by the way. These two chapters together are quite fitting, because they were both, in a part, responses to 19th century conditions.